I always imagined my wedding day as a picture from a storybook. I could almost see it when I closed my eyes. Sunlight spilling across rows of flowers, the sound of music drifting gently through the air, and my mother sitting proudly in the front row, her hands folded tightly together as if holding her entire life's journey in that single gesture. She had raised me alone, through storms, hunger, and endless nights of worry. To me, she was not just a parent, she was my entire world. And I thought that on this one day, the world would finally see her the way I did. But reality shattered that dream. My wedding wasn't just stolen from me, it was twisted into something cruel. I should have been glowing, smiling, radiant in my dress. Instead, my heart was pounding, my hands trembling, because the very people who were supposed to welcome me into their family had decided to humiliate the woman who gave me life. They whispered about her clothes, scoffed at her presence, and then, with calculated coldness, they pushed her out of sight, as if she was nothing more than a stain on their perfect picture. I remember standing there, looking around at the expensive decorations, the glittering chandeliers, the guests laughing with champagne in their hands, and I felt completely out of place. None of it mattered anymore. Not the music, not the vows, not the dress I had once dreamed of wearing. All I could see was my mother, sitting in the farthest corner, isolated, her eyes lowered, her shoulders trembling slightly. They had hidden her, my mother, the strongest woman I knew, like some kind of shameful secret. That image burned itself into my mind. Every step I took down the aisle felt heavier, as though I was walking through quicksand. The whispers followed me like shadows. "She doesn't belong here," someone muttered. "At least they kept her away from the pictures," another voice said, laced with laughter. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stop the ceremony right there and tear the microphone from the MC's hands. But then I heard my mother's voice echo in my mind, words she had told me when I was just a child. "Never let anger steal your dignity. Let truth be your weapon, not your rage." It was that memory that kept me standing, even as my heart cracked inside my chest. Because what they didn't know was that I had a choice. I could swallow the insult, let the day pass, and pretend to smile in the photographs. Or I could strike back in a way that none of them would ever forget. And I did, not with shouting, not with chaos, but with one simple act. Just a message, a handful of words typed into my phone, sent to the one person who could reveal everything they tried so desperately to bury. That message landed like a spark in dry wood, and when it ignited, every sneer, every cruel laugh, every smug expression around me vanished. The entire room fell into a silence so thick it felt like a storm had passed through. In that silence, my mother finally lifted her head, and for the first time that night, I saw her as she truly was, not broken, not diminished, but powerful. They wanted to hide her. I made sure they could never look away again. This is not just a story about a wedding. It's not just about betrayal or humiliation. It's about a daughter who refused to stay quiet, and a mother whose dignity deserved to shine brighter than any crystal chandelier. And before I take you deep into this night, before I tell you every detail of how one message changed everything, I want to invite you to join me here, in this space where truth and justice are never silenced. Make sure you subscribe to Avenged Stories, so you'll never miss the next tale of vengeance, redemption, and the kind of justice that makes your heart pound with satisfaction. Because tonight, I'll tell you how they tried to erase my mother from my wedding, and how, with one message, I made the entire room fall silent. When I was a little girl, I used to believe my mother was unbreakable. To me, she was stronger than the storms that rattled the windows of our small house, tougher than the hunger that sometimes crept into our kitchen, and braver than anyone I had ever met. She never complained, not even when her hands bled from scrubbing floors, or when her back ached after long shifts cleaning other people's homes. Instead, she would smile at me, brush the hair out of my eyes, and whisper, "We'll make it through, Isabella. We always do. Her name is Maria, and she raised me alone after my father left when I was just a baby." Some people called her weak because she didn't remarry. Others pitied her, saying she had no future. But I saw her differently. She was my hero. She worked double shifts, skipped meals so I could eat, and somehow still found the strength to sit by my bed every night. reading me stories until I drifted off to sleep. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And that bond, it was everything. By the time I was old enough to understand sacrifice, I realized my mother had given up her dreams so I could chase mine. She never wore new clothes, never traveled, never asked for anything. When I got into college, she cried, not because she was sad, but because she had finally proven everyone wrong. The girl who grew up with nothing was now stepping into a future they said was impossible, and it was all because of her. But here's the thing. The world doesn't always see people like my mother for who they truly are. They see the old shoes, the worn hands, the simple dress, and they judge. They decide someone's worth by the shine of their jewelry or the size of their bank account. My fiancé's family was no different. From the moment they met Maria, they looked at her like she was less. I should have noticed the warning signs earlier. The way his mother wrinkled her nose when my mom offered homemade cookies. The way his aunt whispered, "She doesn't really fit in with our circle." At the time, I brushed it off, telling myself love was enough. That once they saw the truth about her, the kindness, the courage, the love, they would understand. I was wrong. Planning the wedding should have been joyful, but every conversation with his family became a negotiation, where my mother would sit, what she would wear, even whether she should be in the family photographs. They disguised it as etiquette, but I knew better. They weren't protecting tradition, they were protecting their pride. The final argument came just days before the wedding. His sister called me and said, "Isabella, let's be honest. If your mother is front and center, people will talk. She doesn't belong in the spotlight. Don't you want your day to be perfect?" Her words cut through me like glass. Perfect. As if my mother's presence was a flaw, a stain on the picture they wanted to paint. I wanted to scream that my mother was the reason the day even existed, the reason I had made it that far. But instead, I swallowed the anger, because deep down, I already knew what they planned. They wanted to hide her, and yet I couldn't have imagined just how far they would go, or how much it would hurt when I saw it with my own eyes. That's why I have to tell you this story from the beginning, because to understand the silence that fell on that wedding night, you need to understand the woman they tried so hard to erase. My mother, my hero, the one they thought they could bury in the shadows. They were wrong. The morning of my wedding, I woke up with a strange heaviness in my chest. Brides are supposed to feel joy, nervous excitement, maybe even a little fear, but all I felt was dread. I told myself it was just nerves, that once I walked down the aisle and saw the man I loved waiting for me, everything would fall into place. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. When I arrived at the venue, the first thing I noticed wasn't the flowers or the music or the guests. It was my mother. She wasn't sitting in the front row like we had planned. She wasn't even in the middle. They had placed her all the way at the back, tucked into the shadows near the service doors, as if she was a stranger crashing the event instead of the bride's mother. My breath caught in my throat. My mother's dress wasn't fancy. It was a simple pale blue she had saved up for months to buy. Her hair was neatly pinned, her smile soft but fragile. She looked beautiful to me. But from where she sat, half hidden behind tall decorations, most guests probably wouldn't even notice her, and that was exactly their intention. I forced myself to walk through the room, smiling at guests, shaking hands, pretending I didn't hear the whispers. But I did. Every cruel word carved itself into my skin. At least she's not in the pictures. I wonder if she even knows which fork to use. Poor Isabella. She deserves better than that. They didn't even call her by name. To them, my mother wasn't a person, she was an inconvenience. Something to be managed, hidden, dismissed. And then came the moment that broke me. When the ceremony began, the MC called for both families to come forward, to stand beside the bride and groom. I turned, searching for my mother, but the usher motioned her to stay seated. He shook his head at her, like she was disobedient for even trying to stand. My mother froze in her chair, her fingers twisting her handkerchief until it nearly tore. My fiancé's aunt laughed, loud enough for me to hear. Maybe it's for the best. Wouldn't want to ruin the photographs. The sound of her laughter cut through the music, sharper than glass. Guests around her chuckled. I felt my face burn, my hands shake, my chest tighten as if someone had tied a rope around my lungs. And then I saw my mother's eyes, shiny with unshed tears, cast downward, her shoulders trembling. She wasn't just excluded, she was humiliated. Every instinct in me screamed to stop the ceremony, to grab the microphone and shout at them all. I wanted to tell them who my mother really was, how she had given everything for me, how none of them had the right to treat her this way. But the words stuck in my throat. My wedding day was supposed to be beautiful, and if I exploded in anger, it would only give them more ammunition, more reason to call her unworthy. So I stood there, silent, my heart splitting in two. The vows blurred. The music faded. I barely remember the words spoken at the altar, because all I could think about was the injustice unfolding right behind me. Every smile I forced felt like a betrayal. Every photo taken without her felt like a theft. I realized then that this wasn't my wedding anymore. It belonged to them, their rules, their image, their pride. They thought they had won, that they had successfully erased my mother from the picture, but they were wrong, because while they were laughing, whispering, congratulating themselves on their cruel little victory, I was already planning something else, something quiet, something devastating. And it began with one message. The reception hall glittered with chandeliers and laughter, but to me it felt suffocating. Every corner of the room seemed to echo with whispers about my mother. My new in-laws beamed with pride, their heads held high, while my mother remained invisible at her lonely table, a plate of untouched food in front of her. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She smiled whenever I looked her way, as if to reassure me she was fine, but I knew that smile too well. It was the one she wore when she had no money for groceries, but told me not to worry. The one she used when she was exhausted from working 2 jobs, but said she was just a little tired. A smile that hid pain so I wouldn't feel it. And here she was again, trying to protect me, even while being humiliated. Something inside me snapped. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed some air. My hands shook as I clutched my phone. For months, I had played the obedient bride, swallowing insults, overlooking the snide remarks about my mother, convincing myself that love was worth the sacrifice. But watching her sit there alone, excluded from my own wedding, that was the line. My mind replayed every insult I had overheard. Uneducated, poor, embarrassing. They thought they could erase her. They thought they could erase me. I walked into the corridor, my dress brushing against the marble floor. My heart pounded in my ears, my palms damp with sweat. I stared at my phone screen, debating. If I pressed send, there would be no going back. The facade of harmony, the polite smiles, the carefully orchestrated illusion of a perfect wedding, it would all shatter. But wasn't that what they deserved? I scrolled to one name. Not my bridesmaids, not my groom, not even my father. I opened the thread with Dr. Alvarez. Most people wouldn't understand why, but Dr. Alvarez wasn't just any doctor. He was the mayor's personal physician and a close family friend who had always admired my mother. He knew what she had endured, how she had raised me single-handedly with nothing but grit and sacrifice. And he also knew the mayor, the man my in-laws were so desperate to impress better than anyone. One message from him could change everything. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Trembling with adrenaline, I typed quickly, my heart racing. Major Castillo, if you respect me at all, come into the reception hall. Now. There's something you need to see. I reread it twice, my chest heaving. Then I hit send. The message flew into the void, and with it, my fear. For the first time that day, I felt power return to me, not borrowed. Not fake it, but real. I didn't know exactly what would happen next, but I knew one thing. They had underestimated me. I slipped my phone back into my clutch and walked toward the hall again. The music throbbed. The laughter rang out. The charade continued as if nothing had changed. But in my heart, I knew the clock was ticking. Minutes stretched like hours. Every clink of silverware, every burst of laughter scraped at my nerves. My eyes darted to the entrance. Any second now. And then the doors opened. The mayor stepped inside. Flanked by 2 attendants, the entire room seemed to freeze mid-breath. Conversations halted, forks dropped, and eyes widened. My in-laws straightened in their seats, their smug smiles faltering. They had no idea why he was there, but I did, And as the silence spread across the room like wildfire, I felt the first flicker of satisfaction, because my message had just detonated the first crack in their perfect facade. The moment the mayor walked into the reception hall, everything changed. The music, once lively and deafening, faded into background noise, as if even the speakers themselves were too stunned to keep playing. Guests froze with glasses halfway to their lips, eyes darting between him and my in-laws. Mayor Castillo wasn't a man who attended weddings casually. His presence was reserved for important people, for those who demanded respect. And suddenly, all those who had spent the evening mocking my mother were sitting up straighter, their arrogance cracking under the weight of his unexpected arrival. I held my breath, my heart pounding. "Good evening," the mayor said, his voice calm but commanding. The kind of voice that didn't need to shout to silence an entire room. He scanned the table slowly, his gaze landing on the front row on my groom's parents, who were now pale as marble. "I received a message tonight," he continued, "one that concerned me deeply." Whispers rippled through the crowd. People craned their necks, trying to guess who had written to him, why he was here, what could possibly be so important. My mother lowered her gaze to her lap, clearly assuming none of this involved her. She looked so small at that moment, her hands folded tightly, her shoulders hunched as if she wanted to disappear. But that was exactly why I had sent the message, to make sure she would no longer be invisible. The mayor took a step forward, his shoes echoing against the polished floor. "I was told that someone dear to the bride was not given the respect she deserves, that someone was deliberately hidden, pushed aside, as if she were a stain on this celebration rather than part of its heart." A hush fell over the hall. All eyes followed his words like arrows. And finally, they landed on my mother. She flinched, her cheeks coloring, her hands trembling as she reached for her handkerchief. My throat tightened. For a moment, I feared she might break under the sudden spotlight, but then something remarkable happened. The mayor crossed the room, ignoring the decorated tables, ignoring the frozen smiles of my in-laws, and stopped right in front of my mother. "Señora Elena," he said warmly, addressing her by name, "would you do me the honor of joining your daughter at the front?" Gasps filled the room. Some guests nearly choked on their drinks. My groom's aunt, the same one who had laughed earlier, clutched her pearls so tightly I thought the string might snap. My mother's eyes widened in shock. "Me," she whispered, her voice so faint I barely heard it. "Yes, you," the mayor replied firmly. "This is your daughter's wedding, and I will not stand by while anyone pretends otherwise." For a second, she didn't move, paralyzed by disbelief. Then, slowly, she rose from her chair. Her steps were hesitant at first, as though afraid someone would block her path again. But no one dared, not with the mayor watching, not with the silence pressing down like judgment itself. I felt tears prick my eyes as I extended my hand to her. When her fingers closed around mine, a surge of pride washed through me. For the first time that night, I felt like a bride, not because of the dress, not because of the ceremony, but because my mother was standing beside me, where she belonged. The mayor turned back to the crowd. "I hope," he said, his tone edged with warning, "that from this moment forward, there will be no confusion about who deserves respect in this room." The applause that followed was hesitant, awkward, but it grew. Some clapped out of genuine shame, others out of fear of seeming complicit. But it didn't matter. The damage was done, the facade was broken, and as I looked at my in-laws' faces, stiff, ashen, furious, I felt something cold and sweet settle in my chest. This was only the beginning. The applause still echoed faintly when silence returned, heavier than before. My mother stood beside me, her hand trembling in mine. Her eyes shining with tears, she tried to blink away. For the first time all evening, she wasn't hiding. She wasn't a shadow in the back row. She was where she belonged, at my side. And that single image shattered everything my in-laws had tried to build. I saw it in their faces. My groom's mother clutched her wine glass so tightly I feared it would shatter. His father's jaw worked as if grinding invisible stones. His lips pressed so thin they nearly disappeared. These were people who lived for appearances, for control, for the illusion of being untouchable. And yet, in the span of a few minutes, Their entire performance had unraveled under the mayor's gaze. I almost laughed. The whispers began immediately, slithering through the hall like snakes. Did you see where they seated her? They tried to hide the bride's own mother. What kind of family does that? Guests shifted in their chairs. Suddenly uncomfortable, those who had snickered earlier now avoided my eyes. Their smirks wiped clean. A few even looked ashamed, as if realizing they had joined in cruelty they could no longer defend. My groom's aunt, the one so quick to laugh, fumbled with her pearls again, her cheeks flaming red as people near her began murmuring. The proud, polished mask she wore was cracking, and oh, how satisfying it was to watch. I had been silent for too long. Now, the silence worked in my favor. Thank you, I said clearly, my voice cutting through the room like a blade. Thank you, Mayor Castillo, for reminding everyone here that this is our wedding. Not a performance, not a chance for others to showcase their pride, but a celebration of love and family. My voice didn't tremble. Not this time, because I had nothing left to fear. My groom's father tried to rise, his voice low but strained. Isabella, perhaps we should... No, I turned to face him fully, my hand still gripping my mother's. You should have welcomed her. You should have honored the woman who raised me with nothing but sacrifice and love. Instead, you chose to humiliate her. To humiliate me, and now the entire room sees the truth. The mayor's sharp gaze lingered on them, his silence saying more than words ever could. Guests exchanged glances, their smiles tight, their postures stiff. The energy in the room had shifted completely. My in-laws had spent months painting themselves as the perfect hosts, the flawless family that any bride should be grateful to marry into. But now, they looked small, petty, cruel, and worst of all for them, they looked weak. I could feel the balance of power tilting. For so long, they had controlled the narrative, deciding who mattered and who didn't. But tonight, with one message, I had taken it back. My mother squeezed my hand gently, as if to warn me not to push further. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when the cracks were widening. Not when justice was finally spilling through. So I smiled a calm, deliberate smile that cut sharper than any scream and said, if anyone here thinks my mother doesn't deserve her place at the front, you are free to leave. Now, gasps rippled through the hall. Chairs creaked as people shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to move or stay. My in-laws froze, their faces twisting with fury, but they couldn't speak, not with the mayor standing just a few feet away. No one left, and in that silence, their carefully polished image shattered completely. They had wanted to erase my mother from my wedding. Instead, they had erased themselves. The room still vibrated with the echo of my words, you are free to leave. Now, no one moved, but the silence was deafening, so heavy it felt like even the air itself was waiting for the next blow to fall. That's when I turned and met his eyes. My new husband. For most of the evening, he had been quiet, his expression unreadable. He hadn't laughed with his relatives when they whispered about my mother, but he hadn't stopped them either. He had stood there, a silent pillar, as if neutrality could shield him from guilt. But now, with my mother beside me, with the mayor watching, with every guest's gaze darting between us, his silence was no longer an option. I saw the panic in his eyes first. Then shame, then something darker. Hesitation. My heart clenched. Will you say something? I asked, my voice steady but low. Loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, because this is your family. These are your parents who thought it was acceptable to humiliate mine. And if you think I'll stay quiet about that, you married the wrong woman. The words cut through him like a blade. I could see it in the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his lips parted and closed again without sound. The weight of the room pressed on him, every guest holding their breath, waiting to see which side he would take. His mother leaned forward, her voice a sharp whisper meant to be private, but the microphone on the table betrayed her. Don't you dare embarrass us further. Gasps fluttered through the hall. I almost smiled poetic justice, caught by her own arrogance. My husband's face flushed crimson. His father gripped the armrest of his chair, eyes boring into him with unspoken command. But still, he said nothing. And then I realized this wasn't hesitation, it was fear. For his entire life, he had been taught that family meant obedience, that loyalty meant silence. He had never once stood against them. And now, on the most important day of our lives, I was asking him to do exactly that. I stepped closer, lowering my voice but keeping it firm. "Look at her," I said, nodding toward my mother. "She worked herself to the bone to give me a life. And they treated her like she was nothing. Do you think I'll ever forget that? Do you think we can move forward if you stay silent now?" His eyes flicked to her. For the first time all evening, he truly saw her not as a problem, not as an obstacle, but as the woman who had raised the bride standing before him. His bride? He swallowed hard. Then he turned to face his parents. "Enough," he said. The word wasn't loud, but it hit the room like thunder. His mother's eyes widened. His father's lips parted in shock. "You don't get to treat her like this," he continued, his voice gaining strength with each syllable. "You don't get to dictate who belongs in this family. Isabella's mother is part of my family now, and if you can't respect that, then maybe you're the ones who should leave." The room erupted in whispers, some gasps, some murmurs of approval. My chest swelled with relief and something sharper vindication. For the first time, he had chosen me, chosen us. My mother's hand trembled in mine, and I felt her squeeze, almost disbelieving. Tears slid down her cheeks, but this time they weren't from humiliation. They were from pride. I looked back at my in-laws, their faces drained of color, their perfect masks lying in shards at their feet. And for the first time all night, I allowed myself to smile, because now the battle wasn't just mine. The moment my husband spoke, "Maybe you're the ones who should leave," the atmosphere inside the hall shifted like a storm breaking. Gasps turned into murmurs, murmurs into waves of disbelief. My in-laws had always carried themselves like royalty, people others bowed to without question. But now, their own son had stripped that illusion bare. I turned toward them, and for the first time, I didn't see power, I saw panic. His mother's face twisted in rage, her polished smile gone. She tried to stand, her voice shaking but sharp. "How dare you speak to us this way on your wedding day?" In front of everyone, but instead of fear, her words only sparked more whispers from the guests. "So it's true they tried to keep the bride's mother away? I can't believe it." Disgusting. "They only care about appearances." Her fury bounced back at her like an echo she couldn't control. My groom's father finally rose, towering over the table, his voice cold and commanding. "This is shameful. You have no idea what you're saying. Without us, this wedding wouldn't even what?" I cut him off, my voice steady but loud enough to silence the entire hall. "Wouldn't even be worth celebrating. Wouldn't be worth inviting my mother to." "You've made that very clear." He froze, his face hardening, but the authority in his eyes had already crumbled. The mayor, still standing nearby, crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on him like a judge waiting for the final confession. The silence stretched, and then the mayor spoke, his tone clipped. "Señor Vargas, I've known your family a long time. I've seen pride, I've seen arrogance, but tonight, I've seen cruelty, and I don't tolerate cruelty." The weight of his words dropped like stone on glass. My in-law's perfect mask shattered completely. Gasps filled the room again, this time tinged with satisfaction. Guests who had been silent all evening now leaned forward, watching the mighty family unravel. Some exchanged knowing glances. Others shook their heads in disbelief. It was a spectacle, and every eye was locked on them. My mother stood straighter beside me, no longer shrinking. Her tears had dried, and in their place was a quiet dignity that outshone every jewel in the hall. For the first time, she wasn't the outsider. They were my husband's aunt, the one who had mocked earlier, tried to slink down in her chair, avoiding eye contact as guests around her whispered. Her pearls no longer looked elegant. They looked like a chain choking her neck. And I felt something rise in me. Not anger, not sadness, but triumph. "This is what happens," I said, my voice firm. "When you try to erase the people who matter most, you end up erasing yourselves instead." The hall erupted in applause. Real applause this time, not forced, not hesitant, but thunderous. Guests clapped. Some even stood, their cheers filling the room like justice delivered. My in-laws stood frozen, caught in the spotlight of their own disgrace. Their empire of appearances had crumbled in front of hundreds of witnesses, and no amount of power, wealth, or arrogance could rebuild it. For years, they had controlled the narrative. Tonight, I had rewritten it. I looked at my mother, at my husband, at the sea of guests now united in applause, and I felt the sweetest surge of vindication. This was no longer just a wedding, this was a reckoning, and they had lost. When the applause finally quieted, I stood there, my hand still clasped with my mother's, my husband beside me, and the wreckage of my in-laws' pride scattered across the room like shattered glass. For the first time that night, I could breathe, not shallow, panicked breaths like earlier, but deep, steady ones that filled my lungs with something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The reception didn't continue as planned. The music returned, but softer now, almost hesitant, as if even the band knew this wasn't the same event anymore. Guests began to eat, drink, and laugh again, but the conversations weren't about the decor or the food. They were about what had just happened, about how the perfect family had been exposed, and in every whispered retelling, my mother wasn't invisible. She was at the center. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her eyes were still red from tears, but her shoulders were straighter, her presence no longer hidden. She wasn't shrinking into the shadows, she was shining. She had always deserved to be seen this way. I leaned close and whispered, "You belong here. Mama, you always have." Her lips trembled into a smile, and she squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she'd never let go. For once, I didn't want her to. My husband stayed quiet for most of the evening, but when the crowd thinned and we finally sat together, he took my hand under the table. His grip was firm, steady, different. He wasn't the passive man from before the ceremony. He had finally found his voice and used it for me. For us. And yet, I knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. His parents would never forgive what happened. They would plot, they would sulk, they would lash out in their own ways. But that didn't matter anymore. Because tonight, in front of everyone, they had lost their power over me. They had lost the ability to make me feel small. As the night wound down, I found myself staring at the flickering candles on the tables, reflecting on everything, the humiliation, the anger, the revenge that had unfolded with one simple message. And I realized something. This wasn't just about my wedding. It wasn't just about my mother. It was about every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has ever been shoved aside to protect someone else's pride. It was about standing up when silence feels safer, about speaking truth even when your voice shakes. Because when you finally do, when you demand respect instead of begging for it, the world shifts. People listen, and those who tried to diminish you are forced to face their own reflection. That night, I didn't just marry a man, I married my own strength. As guests hugged me goodbye, many stopped to greet my mother, offering her the respect she had been denied for so long. Some apologized. Others simply bowed their heads with newfound humility. And though it wouldn't erase the pain of what had happened, it gave her something far more valuable than pity. It gave her dignity. When the last of the guests had gone, I walked my mother out into the cool night air. The stars shimmered above us, brighter than the chandeliers inside. She turned to me and whispered, "You didn't have to do that for me." But I smiled, shaking my head. "No. Mama, I did it for us." And as we stood there, the night wrapping around us like a quiet promise, I knew this truth would stay with me forever. Respect isn't given by the powerful. It's claimed by those who refuse to be erased. And on my wedding day, we claimed it. Together. That was my wedding day, messy, painful, but ultimately liberating. I thought I was walking into a ceremony just to start my marriage. Instead, it became the night I finally reclaimed my voice and gave my mother back the place she had always deserved. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder for anyone watching right now, when you refuse to stay silent, when you choose courage over fear, you can rewrite your story even in the unlikeliest of moments. If this story moved you, don't forget there are many more like it. Subscribe to Avenged Stories and join me again next time, where we dive into tales of injustice, revenge, and the unexpected victories that come when people finally take back their power. Because every story deserves its reckoning,